sorry. Okay, لا بعدني عليك. Okay, لا خلاص. Let's get into serious mode.
Yes.
Hi, and thank you for having me. My name is Yafa Masri. I am originally Palestinian, but I'm a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, which means that I grew up in a small refugee camp in the south of Beirut called Borj El Brajneh. I spent most of my life there, but now I'm actually finishing my PhD dissertation at the University of Padova in Italy. And I work on solidarity among refugees and commoning and networks of care in refugee camps for my thesis.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully by the time this episode is out, the PhD will be finished.
Hopefully. I definitely hope so.
I'm not going to jinx it. Okay, so we met last summer in Coimbra. What is the date today? 1st of March 2023, just for the record. We met last summer in Coimbra, which is in Portugal, as part of this summer school called the Pluriverse of Eco-Social Justice. And you were there, of course, and as part of one of the presentations that folks were making, you gave a presentation based on a paper that's called 72 years of homemaking in waiting zones, Lebanon's, and this is in quotation, permanently temporary, unquote, Palestinian refugee camps. And when you mentioned it back then, I was reading this book by Rebecca Solnit, and I obviously thought about it. The book's title is A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. Now, the kind of the thesis of this book, the reason why I thought about this is that it's debunking the myth, which is still pretty widespread, I think, and we see it in our media and just in, the apocalyptic movies and whatnot, that when, for lack of a better term, when shit hits the fan, it becomes like a dog-eat-dog world. Everyone's for themselves, everyone kill each other, rob everything, that sort of thing. And in
survival of the fittest.
Basically, survival of the fittest. And basically, the evidence tends to point the other way. Yes, there are, of course, moments of panic and whatnot. But overall, people do come together. They kind of understand that this is an emergency. This is a disaster of some kind, and we need to come together. And in Katrina, after Hurricane Katrina in the US, you had lots of mutual aid. And basically, after every big disaster, as recently we saw also in Turkey and Syria, people, for the most part, just come together and either volunteer to do something and whatnot. And of course, after the Port of Beirut explosion in 2020, in August 4, 2020 in Beirut, we saw the same thing. Everyone I knew who was there, regardless of nationality, regardless of whatever, were just there and picking up rubble, helping out, donating blood, that sort of thing. And they didn't really need anyone telling them to do so. In fact, the state was completely abandoned the survivors as we know, and people who probably died because of that. So the reason why I thought about this is that obviously the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon are the result, like historically, of the Nakba in Palestine that came came part of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And the Nakba literally means catastrophe. Al-Nakba literally means the catastrophe in Arabic. So in some sense, it's a form of disaster, and it's an ongoing one in many ways. It's one that's been prolonged by Israel first and foremost, obviously, but also in the case of Lebanon, by the state of Lebanon's own policies against Palestinian refugees. So with that sort of framing in mind, can you kind of introduce a bit your paper, talk a bit about it? What does permanently temporary mean, for example? And what drew you to that topic, if that makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting, the topic of the book you mentioned. I'm not familiar with it, but it's so relevant now that you explain it. It's so relevant to the concepts that I'm trying to convey in my work. Obviously, because I am a Palestinian refugee, I'm quite interested in researching topics related to Palestinian refugee camps, and because it is an experience that I went through. So obviously, I'm very personally and politically attached to it. And basically, Palestinian refugees are basically the world's oldest refugee crisis. So it's been going on for over 7 decades, and they're also one of the world's biggest stateless communities. So we are speaking about quite a unique situation in terms of protracted displacement. Mm-hmm. And these refugee camps are the oldest in the world. For example, the one I come from, Borj El Brajneh, was established in 1948. You don't find that anywhere else in the world. There are no other camps that are this old, at least surviving refugee camps. So protracted displacement of Palestinian refugees is quite unique. It's quite intense. And specifically in Lebanon, it is also unique in another layer. So there is this intersectionality, as you mentioned, between being excluded from their lands due to the establishment of the occupation. But then there's also the exclusion from becoming citizens or becoming active participants in Lebanon. In the constitution in Lebanon, it's clearly mentioned that there is never resettlement of non-Lebanese in Lebanon, and this has always been the strategy. I mean, this is also a legacy of French colonialism, because that was established. That part, at least, of the constitution was established with French colonialism, and then it was never changed. It stayed there forever. And that is what excludes Palestinian refugees from being able to access public services, from being just equal to other citizens in the country. With that exclusion, if you compare the statistics or the surveys of Palestinians in Lebanon to all the other Palestinians that exist in the Middle East, the difference is striking. So the Palestinians in Lebanon have the highest rates of abject poverty. They have the lowest rates of education. They have the highest rates of food insecurity. Also related to housing conditions and so on, and employment. They have the worst conditions compared to the refugees, even in Syria, even in Jordan, even inside Palestine. And that's a bit striking, because maybe if you compare the conditions, the economic or living conditions between maybe the West Bank and Lebanon, I mean, before this crisis, at least Lebanon had a better security situation, a better economic situation, but still the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon suffered the worst circumstances. So the problem here is that we have this double exclusion, and you have these this population that is now in Lebanon. I mean, it's estimated between 200,000 to 500,000. We don't know, because there are no clear statistics. Last time that Lebanon had a census was under French mandate. So
in the 30s.
It was in the 30s. There was no census after that. That's crazy. But that's also extended to the Palestinian population, that we don't have a clear census. So the problem is that you have these spaces that are established as temporary, and UNRWA was established as a temporary organization to assist these people. And the mandate of UNRWA was for 6 months and then for a year.
For those who don't know, that's what's the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinians in the Near East. That's a mouthful, but that's it.
Yeah, and it is also one of the oldest organizations of the United Nations, and it's quite unique because there is no other United Nations organization that serves only one group of people. But because it was meant to be temporary, 6 months, 1 year, 2 year, and then here we are, 75 years later. So.
I mean, it says a lot that, it says a lot that it includes the term in the Near East in its title, which is not common anymore these days, but it's still in the title, obviously, because that's how old it is.
Yeah, exactly. So they're even older than the UN 1951 Refugee Convention. They're older than the UNHCR. So they were even established before the UNHCR was established in 1951, before all the conventions. So this is how old it is. Yeah. But they were designed to give temporary assistance. Refugee camps the same way. They were designed to give temporary housing. All of the aid that we see is designed to be temporary. Refugee camps are not designed to be permanent. But then you look at these temporary resources, and these people are there for 75 years. You have 4 generations of Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon, also across the Middle East. But since I am working specifically on Lebanon, you have 4 generations. They're not temporary anymore. And that's such a contradiction, because the kind of assistance you're getting, the kind of resources that you have, the kind of humanitarian aid that you get, it's all designed for temporariness. It's not designed to be permanent, but still these people are making permanent lives. They're still raising generation after generation. They're still inhabiting spaces that are not, let's say, structures or built in very systematically architectural, well-engineered ways. So there is like this gap that we don't have the means needed to build permanent lives because we're not citizens. We don't have access to public services. We're not allowed to construct legally inside the camp, but we are having permanent lives. A lot of people, my family members, were born in Borj El Brajneh and died in Borj El Brajneh. It's you live your entire life there. That's a permanent life. You cannot tell me that's not a permanent life. So there's this contradiction. There's this gap. And I think it's so important to understand this because that means we really need to rethink refugee camps, and we really need to rethink displacement and to redesign working with refugee communities.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. It gives a lot of background to this conversation and context as well. One of the things that's always frustrated me, and I tried to write a essay like, I don't know, a decade ago now. No, not that much, but like, let's say 6-7 years ago now. I mean, that's almost a decade. But on the concept of the other, and this is something that in Lebanon specifically, and this is something that I've taken from James Baldwin, also inspired like the name of this podcast and so on. The Fire Next Time is his book. Because the concept of the other is something fascinating. It's often seen as, when it is studied very seriously, you understand how crucial it is in the formation of certain identities. And in many ways, any identity includes an other. Now, the other doesn't have to be a hostile thing. It just means that, oh, you're not from here. It can just be that, a descriptive rather than something that is inherently negative. But in context of Lebanon, you mentioned how old it is for the refugee crisis, quote unquote, 1948, barely like 5 years after Lebanon officially declared independence, and then de facto independence after the Second World War. And so basically as old as Lebanon, effectively. And this is something that it's very concerning to me. I've been doing what you might call Lebanese studies, for lack of a better term, for way too many years now for my own mental health. But it's something that's so core to the idea of a Lebanon, and yet at the same time not talked about as often as you would. It's categorized separately. You will have like specific studies on, let's say, refugee studies. Then, okay, they go to the camps in Lebanon and they do specific studies in whatnot. And those can be very interesting, very fascinating. Don't get me wrong. But it's not often the case. And when it is, it's very notable because it's very uncommon. And this is across 3 languages, English, French, and Arabic, that you will have a study of Lebanon as a political idea that includes or that integrates this other, quote unquote. And that's very bizarre because it kind of leaves out a very, like, if you're just doing a basic, I'm going to gather all of the data that I can, and I'm going to study all of that data and reach a certain conclusion, the scientific methodology, let's say. It's kind of odd not to include a significant percentage of the population that's as old as the rest of the population as far as citizenship goes, in terms of like you became Lebanese in 40s, whatever.
Especially that Lebanon is the country that hosts the highest percentage of refugees in the world. So according to the UNHCR, Lebanon has the highest. There's like, I don't remember. I think it's 1 out of 5 people or 2 out of 5 people in Lebanon are refugees. So that's the highest percentage on the planet. Yeah. For that country to have that, it's very strange.
And you see, the reason why we're bringing it up in this context is that when we talk even about the concept of sectarianism in Lebanon, which it's not going to be the main topic of this conversation because I've done this too many times, but it is important to bring up because most Palestinian refugees in Lebanon happen to be Sunni Muslims. And in Lebanon, sectarianism is a huge thing. The reason why my grandfather, who was, and I'll mention this more later, who was born in Haifa and raised in Haifa and met my grandmother in Haifa, she was herself, she still is with us, Italian. The reason why they moved to Lebanon and in the 50s, moved to Lebanon is because of the Nakba, but then in the 50s, they became Lebanese citizens is because my grandfather was a Christian. And this was part of the politics of the 50s at the time, on the Shamon and so on. So this is like, it's not a detail in the story. I grew up not knowing that we are part Palestinian. I had no idea until the age of 16. But I'll mention that in a bit. I keep on teasing it and not talking about it. But the reason why it's so crucial to talk about it in terms of sectarianism is because in the calculation of the politicians who want to maintain the system as it is, they say so. They use those terms explicitly. Gibran Bassil infamously, a good friend of the podcast, infamously mentioned like some years ago that that, yeah, he is in favor of Lebanese women passing on the nationality, because that's still not allowed in Lebanon, to their spouse and to their children, as long as you exclude specifically Syrians and Palestinians. Like they cannot do it, make it into law, because there's no way of doing so without very explicitly discriminating. And so they just don't do it at all. And it's such a core component of everything. Like I took part in the uprisings in 2015 and 2019, and there were Palestinian refugees, friends of mine, who were among us. They were just there. There was nothing distinctive, quote unquote, about them, with the exception of a few who flew the Palestinian flag. But for the most part, they were just like other, Beirutis or Tripolitans. I don't know how to say someone from Tripoli in English. Someone from the north, someone from the south, or whatever. And
because what happens in Lebanon directly impacts them. Like they are part of that country. Like if the economy changed, they're changing. If the laws change, their life is like they're living there. It's crazy that they're not considered like they have rights, or that they are part of the country.
Exactly. And this, because it's so, it's rendered invisible in many ways. Again, we talk about it, people know, but like you don't make it too, and Palestinian friends who were there kind of felt it, and Syrian friends the same for that matter, but like kind of felt it that like, don't make yourself too visible. Be there as just another person on the streets or whatever, but don't specifically say that you're there as a Palestinian or whatever, because then you can definitely be, and this is what happened, of course, been the target of media smearing, OTV saying like Daesh is coming from Idlib to Tripoli, and, shit like ISIS and shit like that. So it's such.
My mom told me the same, by the way. My mom told me the same in 2015. She was like, and I will translate this in the best way possible. Like, oh, it's going to be in the news the next day that the Palestinians are infiltrating the protests, trying to ruin it, and you're planting things, or you're spying, or whatever, and.
Yeah. I mean, we're laughing about it, but it's a real problem. It's a real problem. So. Okay, let me, I wanted to ask the question about home and whatnot, but it's an awkward transition. I'll ask it in a bit. I'll mention the background that my own background, and the reason why it's relevant to this conversation. I mentioned it a few times on the podcast, but not that frequently, because for the most part, I don't know how to talk about it, and I still struggle to talk about it. But as I said, I didn't know we were Palestinians until the age of 16, 17. And the reason why I knew, it's actually funny. It's a ridiculous story, but it's kind of funny at the same time, and probably sad also, as in مضحك مبكي, as we say. But basically, we were doing a genealogy thing for school, like a school project. And I go to my grandmother, who, as far as I knew, was just this Lebanese woman from Zahle, which is in the Ba'a, in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley. And I ask her, okay, I'm doing this, genealogy tree, whatever, and I need to know where everyone was born and when and whatnot. And so she says, okay. And I think on the moment she forgot that she was supposed to lie to me. And she said, born 19, I don't know, 20 something or early 30s, Shihek, something like that, in Haifa. And I was like, what? My reaction was, shoo? And like Lebanese, like, what? Like, and she's like, yeah, in Haifa. I was like, and then she said, Zahle.
It's like a small neighborhood in Zahle. Like she probably wanted to fix this.
Famous Haifa neighborhood of Zahle.
Mabna Haifa, that's the name of the building. Sorry,
So after that, she was like, on the spot, she didn't quite recognize what happened. So she went along. She actually told me part of the story. She didn't tell me entirely, and in a completely incoherent way. And she wasn't actually born in Haifa. She was born in Italy, but she grew up in Haifa where she met my grandfather. So she wasn't even, she told the wrong lie, because it's my grandfather who was born in Haifa. She got confused in the lies. So instead of telling me he was born in Haifa, she said, I was born in Sicily, but he was born. It was a complete mess. Long story short, like after a number of years of like poking and prodding and asking some questions here and there. And then at one point, my father got his aunt, so my grandmother's sister, he got her drunk apparently one evening and whatnot. And so she spilled the beans and she started talking about this entire story. And the story is, yes, my grandmother we have suspicion that she might have been Jewish growing up, because she was with the wave of Jews that went from southern Italy to Palestine at the time, during the Holocaust, essentially, or just before the Holocaust, I mean. And so she met my grandfather in Haifa at some point. Then they moved to Lebanon in 48. We know that it happened during the Nakba. And probably to kind of simplify their lives or whatnot, they said that they are both Lebanese Christians. Not to say that they are one Palestinian Jew and one Palestinian Christian who moved to Lebanon and now have to deal with like refugee status or whatever. So they both said that they're Lebanese Christians. And that's the story that they maintained until my grandmother accidentally said that the wrong birthplace, basically. And so I remember once we went with school, we went to a road trip to Zahle, and my grandfather telling me, hey, you're going to meet our relatives and whatnot. And so I went to Zahle because I had never gone there, thinking that, because there are ayoubs from Zahle, like there's a family there, thinking that I'm going to meet relatives, and whatnot. And I was telling friends in the bus, like, yeah, we're going back to where my grandfather's from and whatnot. I didn't know anyone. No one was there. There wasn't anyone to talk to. It was just there. My grandfather thought that I would just forget maybe or something. So when I came back home, I told him that there was no one. What are you talking about? He said, oh, maybe they were busy. So
this is crazy.
Yeah, but I honestly think it's not. So this specific, the fact that it's so ridiculous might be very specific, but the story itself of rendering things invisible is not uncommon in Lebanon. And a lot of the formation of the nation state itself has been basically erase everything that you were before this artificial date, basically. Don't talk about how maybe your grandfather was Turkish or maybe your aunt was Armenian. Armenian is different, but like, don't talk about these kinds of identities, because khalas, the state has been created and now you're just one of those, 18 accepted boxes, and just don't have a 19th, because that our brains will break if you do that. And so it's at the core of the concept of the nation state formation in Lebanon and the formation of sectarianism. The reason why sectarianism was even prolonged to this day, a good part of it is because if you don't have sectarianism, you have to quote unquote deal with the Palestinian question or with the refugee question. Because without sectarianism, then there's no boogeyman to say, well, if you naturalize them, you'll have 200,000 more Sunni voters and whatnot, because that's the only thing that matters in the logic of sectarian calculation. So I don't quite know how the Lebanese, for the most part, with some exceptions, want to tackle sectarianism without also tackling the quote-unquote refugee question. Because Lebanon is one of those countries that doesn't give refugee status at all. You cannot claim asylum in Lebanon, with the exception of, I think, one person was ever given asylum in Lebanon, this Japanese person in like the early 80s or something like that. But for the most part, you're not
Lebanon given. Lebanon is not a signatory to the 1951 refugee. Exactly. They never signed it, so they're not like legally obliged to do it, but obviously they're not interested in doing it also.
Exactly. So all of this brings us to the topic of bordering, creating identities by having an inside and an outside, an inner group and an outside group or whatnot. And there's a concept by Shad Elias, who's this Lebanese scholar who wrote an excellent book whose name I forgot. I'll try and remember it throughout this conversation. But he calls it like a bordering practice, like literally the practice of creating a border. And in Lebanon, it's very visible in many ways. One of the first things people who have never been there comment, especially if they go to like Beirut, but like honestly, most of Lebanon is kind of like that, is they see so many sectarian flags, so many party flags. You go to one neighborhood, you have Hezbollah flags. Another neighborhood, you have Uwait or Lebanese Forces flag and whatnot. And sometimes this is the only reference you have to actually know that you're now in a different part of Beirut, because like most of Beirut kind of looks the same in terms of building architecture and whatnot. But those are the ways that you now know, I have entered quote unquote a Hezbollah area, or I have entered a Kataib area, or a Falangist area or whatever. And I remember this very clearly because once I was just walking in Beirut, because I did not grow up in Beirut, so I wanted to discover the city and whatnot. And at one point I walked into what I think was Borj El Brajneh. I just can't remember on the spot. And the only reason I knew I entered it at the time, this was before the quote unquote security stuff where they erected a bunch of whatever, is that I saw a bunch of Palestinian flags. And that's like, oh, I'm here now. I didn't know. I was just walking. I had this thing of walking aimlessly around Beirut. And I just remember feeling it in my body because like by then, And this was around the time I discovered that we were partly Palestinians as well. But I had been primed, I feel like, after, I don't know, a decade and a half of growing up, not really at home. At home, they didn't really talk about Palestinians, probably part of the taboo, but at school. Because I went to like a very homogeneous Catholic school in the mountains and whatnot. And I was sort of primed to feel like, oh, I have entered a different space. This is no longer Lebanon, or this is no longer Beirut, or this is no longer whatever. And none of this was conscious. This was completely inherited fears and biases and whatnot, which obviously in my case also internalized, because it was meant also to distance myself from part of my own identity. And so I wanted to, with all of this, and I feel like I spoke for too long, but like, what do you see the relationship between creating borders, bordering, if we might call it that way, and the actual topic of this conversation, homemaking? Like, what's the relation between those two?
Yeah, it was really interesting, everything you said. I just feel like I want to like reflect a bit, because you did mention the idea of the other and the othering and creating the other. And there's also this really interesting work by Sujuk, and he also he emphasizes the other, but like in terms of displacement and refugees and specifically refugee camps. And he says that states always need to establish the necessary other through refugees or refugee camps in a way, because they kind of emphasize to the citizen how much you need me as a state. So point of view as state, it's kind of implying to its citizens, oh, well, this is what happens to people who abandon their state, who go against their state, who withdraw from their state, who upset their state. They get dismissed, and look at the bad stuff that happens to them. They live a humiliated life. So it's, in a way, it's creating discipline for citizens by showing them, oh, you know what? If things go bad between me and you as a citizen in the state, you're going to end up stateless. You're going to end up exiled. You're going to end up. It's creating this fear of what happens to you when you don't get along with the state. So it's creating this discipline of, well, you know what? You don't want to be a refugee because I'm showing you exactly what refugee camps look like. So it's creating this necessary other to kind of discipline also the public or the nation against social movements, against riots, against any kind of demonstrations that jeopardizes this kind of obedience towards the state. So it's so it is a way of establishing the necessary other, but in a disciplined format. So it's it's pretty crazy how human populations that are living in distress are also being punished as a tool of disciplining the citizens. So it is crazy, but on the other hand, there's also this really interesting article, and I think it was published by the National Geographic many years ago, but it relates to your experience and to how identity is formed. And I think it's called something like, in the 21st century, we're all migrants. And the article just builds on this historical framework, but in simple terms really says, you know what? Humanity did not originate in Cairo or Los Angeles or Sicily or Tokyo. Many centuries ago, none of these civilizations even existed. And technically, if we all come from Mother Africa, then we've all migrated from Africa to the other continents, to the hotspots in these continents, to other cities, from the cities to the villages, or vice versa. So technically, we all migrated along the years. So none of us, or probably not just migrated, but probably we were refugees due to changes in agriculture, lack of access to food, weather conditions, and so on. So along our histories and along our family lines, we're all migrants. We're all forced migrants. We're all protracted migrants. So we're not really that different at the end of the day. So the whole idea of purity and my line of family is Lebanese or American or European, it's never really true. It's just, as you said, we invisibilize it over the years. So it's but yeah, also maybe it's for simplicity, but it's also very interesting to talk about simplicity, because also for me, for example, here, and I'm sure the other Palestinian refugees, especially in Lebanon, do the same thing, because you get asked, for example, I'm here in Italy. Everywhere I go, I get asked the simple question of, where are you from? In your case, you would say, I'm Lebanese. In my case, I would say, I'm Palestinian. And then people would say, okay, so where do you live in Palestine? And I'm like, well, I don't live in Palestine. I kind of grew up in I was born in Lebanon. I grew up in a small refugee camp in Lebanon. And then they would be, so you're Lebanese. I'm like, no, I'm not Lebanese. They're like, okay, we're confused. What kind of nationality, citizenship do you carry? And I'm like, I don't carry citizenship. I'm not legally Lebanese and I'm not legally Palestinian. And this is to explain a bit the legal aspect is that because I come, for example, from the city of Yafa, and Yafa after 1948 became occupied and became part of the state of occupation of Israel, then Yafa is no longer a Palestinian city. So legally, I do not have a Palestinian citizenship. I cannot be Palestinian because the place I'm from is no longer legally Palestinian. So now I'm not Palestinian. I'm not Lebanese. I'm not, in the eyes of the law, I'm not really anybody. So for simplicity, I sometimes drop it and say, I'm Lebanese because I don't want to go through that entire process of 15 minutes of explaining Middle Eastern history and Nakba and like a few segments of international law. Because just to say where I'm from, I have to explain these, I have to use at least 10 references, 5 history books, and a few news.
And by the time you're done, your coffee is cold and you're...
And they don't get it, at the end, like you explain it and it's still not clear. But I can't blame them because even for me, it's still not clear. Years later, I've lived in this situation 33 years and it's still not clear for me how this happens. So So I can't imagine what it's like for strangers. So yeah, for simplicity, I either say I'm Palestinian, and when they say where from in Palestine, I just say the West Bank, and I get this story done with, or I just say I'm Lebanese, I'm from Beirut. And I just hope that they never get to see my documents and never figure out that I wasn't lying though. I was just, simplifying things because I'm too...
Yeah, I'm that. No follow-up questions.
Yeah. And speaking of also like your experience of going into a camp, there's a really nice documentary that is called, I don't know, you've probably seen it. You're a movies guy. You've probably seen it. A World Not Ours, عالم ليس لنا, for I think Mahdi Flehel or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting document. It's a bit old by now, and I think it's a really nice way if somebody watching wants to visualize what life in the camp looks like, but also this movement between the camp and the world of the camp and how it interacts with the borders. And I think that's such a nice way to enter the topic of homemaking within the borders, because as you said, it's not that clear. I mean, the borders are always made and remade in Lebanon to confine refugee camps. But in my opinion, and what I always try to argue, is that the camp resists, and also the city somehow resists that. And somehow these borders always get blurred up. So borders are established whether they are military checkpoints or whether they are legal confinement or whether they are the conditions of buildings and architecture that you see. But one of the arguments, for example, are the way that the slum areas, or as we call them, the Masri belts, sometimes they get so entangled with the like they expand so much, the living conditions in Beirut, for example, they expand or they deteriorate so fast, especially in the economic crisis, that the slum areas actually expand and they intertwine with the refugee camp. And you can't tell the difference anymore. You can't tell when I'm exiting the slum area and I'm just going into the refugee camp, because living conditions are deteriorating everywhere. Housing conditions are deteriorating. People are building more informal areas. And that's a consequence of the political system. That's a consequence of the economic system, which is apparently not just excluding Palestinians, but excluding a lot of classes in Lebanon, excluding a lot of groups and a lot of minorities. So they are like overlapping with each other. All of these people that are abandoned by the state, whether they're citizens or not, they're overlapping in their living conditions, that those borders are not really that clear anymore. And one of the things that I try to focus on is the different ways that the camp resists, but also in a very subtle way. So, for example, in one of the papers, I try to focus on how the Palestinian refugees or the camp interacts with other refugees or other minorities in the city. And I think this is a bit of a common knowledge. People who live in Lebanon always see that Palestinian refugee camps are not just a resident for Palestinian refugees, but a lot of people who are low income or underprivileged or even migrants or domestic helpers who need to have cheaper housing, who don't have access to the very expensive housing of Beirut. And so instead they move to live into the camp because life is cheaper there. And nobody tells you in the camp, no, you cannot rent here or you cannot have this house because you're not a Palestinian refugee. Nobody cares because here we're all refugees, we're all excluded, we're all the ugly duckling of the city. So you have, for example, a large number of Syrian refugees also that live in Palestinian refugee camps. And there's really great papers done by Elena Fedaiin Qasmi, and she works on this refugee to refugee humanitarianism and how with all of these waves of Syrian refugees, for example, a lot of them were just being hosted in Palestinian refugee camps, given housing, given emergency aid by refugees themselves, not by humanitarian aid. And this was especially important when we had the closing of the borders in the face of Syrian refugees, which was crazy because the crisis in Syria didn't end. But we decided in Lebanon that the crisis ended and we don't need any more to take in Syrian refugees. So let's close the border. And you know why this is crazy? Because technically they closed the borders first in the face of Palestinian Syrians. So Syrians were still allowed to enter, but Palestinian refugees that come from refugee camps in Syria, they were not allowed to enter. And this is crazy because they were fleeing exactly the same war. The war is happening in Syria and it's happening to both of them. So it's not logical that you say, no, you as Palestinians, you're safe in Syria, but the Syrians are not safe. So, and it took another year and a half to block it for everybody, which was also such a crazy action, not just because we're blocking safe entry of humans that are under threat, but also because obviously that didn't work. That never works. And I think if there is something that we have to learn from humanitarian crisis is that blocking entry of humans only makes the crisis worse, because if the violence didn't end, people are still going to be crossing, whether in safe ways or not in safe ways. What is it going to take to make us understand that people are fleeing life-threatening events? Whether you close the borders or not, they're still going to have to flee. So of course they're going to flee in unauthorized manner. And because people were fleeing in unauthorized manner, they were ending up in Palestinian refugee camps because this is the place where they cannot be scrutinized or captured by the government. So that's why also Palestinian refugee camps were hosting a lot of Syrian refugees, and it became kind of this, this welcoming space for them. But for example, one of the issues that I wrote a paper about was when I was trying to study how Palestinian refugees were handling the pandemic. I did this field work. I was staying there for a while. I spent part of the pandemic there, and I was trying to observe how people are establishing commons, how they're creating solidarity, because we were second-class beneficiaries of healthcare during the pandemic, because obviously we don't have equal access to public healthcare in Lebanon. But in the pandemic, things got worse, and we definitely had second-class access to everything. And so there were all of these structures that were done in a grassroots manner between people, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's food sharing, to try to respond a little bit to the impact of the pandemic. So there was this medical center that was established in Borj El Brajneh camp, where they were treating for free people who were infected, helping them quarantine, providing them with food, but also caring for them, especially those who didn't have someone to care for them. And there was like this quarantine facility, and there was medical volunteers and nurses and so on. And when I went there, to my surprise, I saw very few Palestinian refugees. I saw Syrian refugees that were undocumented, so they were afraid of going to any medical facility outside the camp because they were afraid of getting deported. I saw domestic helpers or domestic employees.
Domestic workers, yeah.
Exactly. That had earlier fled their employers or had problems with their employers, and so they lost their visa, or they're working in the black market, and they're also afraid of getting caught. So they caught the virus, and they're afraid to go into any hospital. They're afraid to go into any doctor, any clinic, because they might get a treatment, but then they're going to get deported. So they actually came to Borj El Brajneh to receive treatment, and it was like this way of showing how much the camp is actually porous, how much the camp expands, how much the camp welcomes people, especially people who are abandoned by the city, how much is connected to the city, but also how much it is a space of rescue, which is, I think it contradicts a lot with the idea that we present of the camp in Lebanon as dangerous, as unsafe, as a bad place. And it really just it helps people a bit understand that it's also a welcoming space. It's also a space of support. It's also a space of rescue. It's a safe haven for many people who are often abandoned by the state in life-threatening manner.
Mm. Yeah, it's literally that. It's a safe haven, like from the perspective of, to use that example of the camp, it's the rest of the country that is hostile, that is dangerous. If anything, I mean, to paraphrase your mom, I think a lot of, probably most Palestinians in Lebanon are fully aware of the limitations and how visible can one be, like I think of this example, I had given it in that essay actually. On two different occasions I had, on more occasions, but specifically those two different occasions, I had a very interesting contrast in how visible can someone be in some areas. Because, I mean, for listeners who don't know, I mean, for the most part, there isn't really a quote-unquote clear-cut way of telling a Lebanese from a Syrian, from a Palestinian, from most people who are physically in Lebanon right now. Sometimes it's the accent in Arabic, but for example, in the case of Palestinian refugees, in many cases, you don't even have that because, as you said, like third, fourth generation. So I have this friend who was coming from on one of the camps, I think from Shatila, and she was coming to my house in the mountains, so in Mount Lebanon, an area that's pretty quote unquote homogeneous in the sense that like I grew up with mostly other Lebanese Christians and whatnot, and she didn't have any in terms of like audible, because this is a bordering practice as well. So in terms of an accent, she didn't have anything distinguishable in that sense from someone else from Beirut, let's say. So maybe someone listening to her might say, oh, she's from Beirut or whatever. But she was wearing a keffiyeh. And a keffiyeh is distinctive visually for someone from the mountain as like, oh, this is a Palestinian from Beirut or whatever. And so at some point when we entered more or less like our area, she started feeling a bit uncomfortable and she removed the keffiyeh. And of course I was like, you don't have to and whatnot. But in the end, she felt like it's probably safer if she just whatnot, just at the very least to avoid any headache, because she was actually thinking about me. She wanted me not to have to worry about whatnot. So she removed the keffiyeh, she left it in the car, and she entered, she came, went into the house and whatnot, and everything was fine after that. Another time, it was a Syrian friend who was from, I think from the south of Syria, or on the spot, I can't remember right now, but who was also visiting our house. And he was a refugee. He had been in Lebanon for like 4 or 5 years, but he grew up in Syria. So he had a distinctive Syrian accent when speaking Arabic. And so for him, it wasn't anything physical. It was something auditory. Like he couldn't talk out loud without it being super obvious to a Lebanese ear that this person is from Syria. It's usually the instead of the, stuff like that. And so what we end up doing, which is such a ridiculous thing, is that and his English was very bad, but we end up just speaking in English in my house, in the garden of my house, where at the best, maybe my grandmother who lives above us can hear us, and that's about it. Like no one can actually hear us there. We're surrounded by a field, and some chickens and like a few trees and whatnot. So no one actually could hear us, but so paranoid. He was so worried at the tiny possibility of someone even knowing that he's Syrian, that we ended up mostly talking in English in my own garden. Like that's how, for me, that's an example of a bordering practice that's kind of intangible in the sense that it's not physical or it's not like visual, it's more auditory, and can still be very, very oppressive. And so in the context of like a Palestinian refugee or a Syrian refugee, you have all of those multiple layers of basically like, I would imagine just growing up knowing or being taught eventually, or maybe learning the hard way because of some occurrence or whatnot, of the things that you can do and the things that you cannot do, and often more like the things that you cannot do. And then you have to position yourself based on all of the things that you cannot do. And I remember, like, what was it, a few years ago? The government decided to allow certain jobs that were, as of now, excluded to Palestinian refugees. And there's something we should say, that Palestinian refugees in Lebanon to this day are excluded from pretty much most jobs. So they said, okay, a few more jobs your Palestinians are allowed to access. And within a month or so, I think it was the Maronite church that complained about it. And so they had, I forgot the details, but something along those lines. They then withdrew. And I just remember the day, like when it was announced that, yeah, more jobs are allowed. Like so many friends that I knew were like ecstatic, like, yeah, we can be, I don't know, engineers or whatever. And
we've been waiting for this our entire lives. Exactly. I remember when that came out, I was like, this is news that I've been waiting 30 years to hear, because you don't know what it's like to grow up and you know, when you're a kid and you're like, yeah, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a doctor. We couldn't do that. We were taught you have to keep your ambitions so low, because you're going to get your heart broken, because even if you graduate as a doctor, you cannot work as a doctor. You cannot work as a
pharmacist. That's the thing. You can study as a doctor. You can be qualified as a doctor from a Lebanese university, but then you just cannot work as one.
Exactly. And it was so ironic. I don't know if you've heard about this story. There was this famous case of, I think she was a Palestinian refugee from some camp in Bekaa area, and she was accepted as one of the world's youngest medicine students. She went into med school. She got like a full ride, probably graduated at the age of 16 or something. And then when she returned to Lebanon, she had this takreem, this ceremony by the Lebanese president. And it was so ironic because she was getting honored as like one of the Middle East's youngest doctors, but she couldn't work as a doctor in Lebanon. It was like so mind-blowing that, yeah, that's great. We're throwing her this party, giving her this medal by the Lebanese president. And then, yeah, what am I going to, do I hang it on the wall? Like, does it mean anything to you that you're honoring me, recognizing that I cannot use this certificate? I cannot help cure people and rescue people's lives. It's so disturbing how we choose not to acknowledge the contradictions.
I think she left at some point and started practicing eventually somewhere in the US. I don't remember the details, but something like that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's such a common problem. I don't know how. It's one of those things that is so. Like, I mean, we obviously understand each other, like, but I'm also thinking of like listeners who maybe have no idea what we're talking, and at least have no idea of the context of what we're talking about. And so it's the same thing. It's not the same thing, but I have a similar experience, or similar enough experience, when I sometimes explain certain things from Lebanon, because on the surface, and justifiably so, they are so absurd and they make no sense, like from any logical, like even from this is good for you, you need more doctors, clearly that's a good thing, or whatever. From all of those perspectives, nothing makes sense. But then when you integrate a sectarian logic, it's like, okay, right, yeah, right, okay, it's about competition, it's about quotas, and it's about how many, the politicians, how many sectarian, in terms of representation in parliament, what's the percentage of the sect that you're going to have and whatnot. In that case, this makes sense. This is about whatever, Aish Mushtarak, cohabitation and shit like that. And so, it can work within the very, very tiny, narrow logic, or in an already very tiny country, and nothing else has to make sense. Just this tiny sliver of a kind of an internal logic has to make sense. And even if it harms everything else, if it harms the public sector, the private sector, hospitals, education, pretty much everything else, we're still we, as in the state, is still not going to actually remedy it on a very basic level. Like, even if, because obviously the big boogeyman is Tautin, and the big boogeyman is like, oh, if they stay, you know, that's again the Gibran Basile, who I love to quote, of course, who had posted something on Instagram, like I think it was in 2014 or something, basically saying, like, warning against Syrian refugees, and basically saying, remember what happened when Palestinian refugees got too comfortable in Lebanon, i.e., you know, they caused the civil war and they caused all of that stuff, which is loaded with so much baggage that I don't even have time right now to get into it for the purpose of this podcast. But all he did, it was just a photo of a refugee camp from the 50s. I remember this very well, or 48, 49, I don't remember, like from the early days, right after the Nakba, and just saying, just remember. That's it. Just remember. And all of the subtext and the connotations and whatnot immediately understood by everyone who knew what he meant. Like, if you don't know the context, if you don't, it's like, well, you remember what? There's a bunch of tents. But no, for him is remember those people that we welcomed, and I'm putting, people cannot see me doing the quotations with my fingers, but we welcomed all of those people and whatnot. And then look at what they did. Look at, i.e., all of the problems of Lebanon are, of course, because we were so nice in the 40s. And it's such an amazing, again, in quotation, it's such an absurd and ridiculous statement that in many ways it works because it's so absurd and ridiculous, because it requires a divorce from reality from the people who still believe these things, that they need one another to kind of have this mutually assured delusion, as I call it. Like, they have to mutually reinforce one another's fear or hatred or whatnot of the other, their conceptualization of the other, which almost always has nothing to do with anyone actually existing. Because in order for the other to remain in other, you need to not talk to people. You need to not meet them. You need to not know who they are, how they talk, you know, oh, they actually talk like us, you know, none of these things, all of these things, there has to be this bordering practice. Most of the time invisible, like it's not always a line on the map, although sometimes it is in the case of confinement and whatnot. But most of the time it's just like, it's just there. You just need to know growing up, don't go there. That's it. You don't need to know anything else. You don't need to be given any kind of information about a camp, let's say. You just need to be told growing up, just don't go there. This is literally what I heard growing up. And if you don't know better, or if you're not lucky like me and you end up meeting folks at some point in Beirut and then you did your studies and whatnot, this can just become an embodied thing. You may intellectually know that this is wrong. You may have read the book or may have, you know, reasoned your way out of this. Like, this is clearly not good. But even like in your body, it stays in the sense that you know which areas you can go or you should go. And you know which areas, there might be more risks, quote unquote, if you go, because you've been told that your entire life. And this ends up becoming like a de facto bordering practice that people end up doing without even thinking about it. Like, it's part of the makeup. It's part of the wallpaper of Lebanon that I knew, for example, when I was 16 or 17, there were a couple of Syrian workers that came to our house to work on the garden or something like that, because the house was pretty middle class. And I just knew immediately those guys are not Lebanese. That's it. Nothing was said. No one talked to me. I just heard them speak, you know. It was just there. It was kind of like in the background. It's like almost in the ether. Like, you know, it's like, a non-Lebanese has entered the room, you know, it's something like that. And it's amazing that none of this involved a thought. Like, I never was actually told explicitly, we hate these people or these people are not like us or whatnot. But it was more like, hey, it's a vibe. You know, it's something that you just know growing up somewhere. This person isn't from here or whatnot. And therefore you can be nice. You can talk nice, but be careful, you know, keep it in back. You just stay on your toes or whatever I'm thinking in Arabic here. Like, you know, keep your expression, keep your guards up, you know, that sort of thing. And this is a bordering practice at the end of the day. And it ends up kind of reinforcing everything we've been talking about, because even in sites of protests, even among activists, even among whatnot, you will have people like Lebanese people specifically who, you know, maybe privately are completely fine with refugee rights and all of that stuff, but I'll say like, this is too complicated. We cannot deal with this now. We can't have Palestinians among protesters who are too visibly Palestinian. Sure, they can come, but like don't tell anyone. Just be a body on the street, but don't physically, don't express yourself in a quote unquote non-Lebanese way or whatnot. And as I said, I was one of the organizers of the 2015 uprising, and this was never said out loud. Like, it wasn't explicitly said, but it was almost like, hey, it was understood. It was kind of, again, it was part of the, I don't know how to explain it to listeners, but growing up in that context, it's like so much of the language is completely wordless. You don't need to say anything. It's body language and some visual cues and some maybe auditory cues and whatnot. And somehow we formed an entire, whatever you want to call it, based like that. At the very least, it's reinforced by those things. Yeah, I don't know if you had some thoughts on that.
No, I totally agree. And the whole thing you were saying, I was like saying in my head, it's so true also on the other side that we could feel these things. None of us had to talk. It's like so embodied in us that we're already so apprehensive all the time. We're already so also afraid. I mean, this is the only difference about, I think, how you narrated your experience and how I would narrate mine, that our side of the experience is loaded with so much fear all the time because you're being judged. That you're the outsider. That you're the one who's less protected by law. You're the one that's less protected by sects and by I don't know, by the state in general. You feel threatened. You feel unwanted. You feel also, because a lot of times we are pushed to do things illegally because that's the way to survive. I mean, I remember most of the jobs that I've had, even if they were administrative jobs, if they were in big companies, I wasn't registered as an employee because I wasn't legally allowed to work in these jobs, at least. They were like administrative jobs and procurement and accounting, but I wasn't allowed to do them. So I was always like afraid I could be let go any day. I could be, if we get a surprise inspection, I was always afraid of upsetting my employer because if anything happened, I couldn't sue them. They could fire me for some reason, for no reason, but also around people in general. I always felt scared of being accused that I'm bringing the riots to the protest. I'm the one implanting something. I'm infiltrating protests to create violence or to ruin things.
Do you know about Schrodinger's refugee?
What is that?
Schrodinger's cat. You never know if so. It's an idea. It's a kind of a theoretical experiment, whatever it's called, that basically in theoretical physics or whatever it is, if you put a cat in a box, at some point you have no way of knowing whether the cat is alive or dead. So in theory, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. You can't know. So Schrodinger's immigrant or Schrodinger's refugee, it's something that's been said in Europe, are both very lazy and at the same time they're taking everyone's jobs. They're both things at the same time. And in Lebanon, they're very lazy, but also they manage to destroy everything all the time. They cause traffic, cause a crisis of trash. It's raining because of them. There was, when the wildfires happened in 2019, Syrian refugees especially were blamed for causing some of the fires and then moving into the houses that were on fire because refugees are fireproof. All of those stuff. This is part of the discourse.
Yeah, the idea that we are consuming the state's resources, like we're causing the economic burden in Lebanon, even though Lebanon isn't giving us anything. Like, we're not benefiting. Like, I remember the only time that I had a legal job. It was so funny because I was paying for the Social Security contribution, but I'm not entitled to get anything. Like, I pay for the health daman, what we call it daman, which is the health kind of Social Security. But like, it was very clear that like, you cannot ask for anything. You're not covered. And I was like, explain this to me. Why am I paying if I can't get anything? You're like, yeah, because you're a Palestinian refugee. You're not entitled to get anything. But then why am I paying for it? Yeah, because that's the law. So it's also that contradiction that like we are told that we are consuming the resources of the state and we're like burdening it and we're taking things away from Lebanese. But at the same time, we're not taking anything from the state. We're not benefiting from the state in any way. And it's like, I don't get how they do so well at framing us in that portrait. How does it work so well? It's unbelievable.
Yeah. I don't know what to say. It is. I guess I can only say that one day because I had written, as I said, this essay that was like part 1, and I published it on Jumhuriya.net, not the Saudi one, the Syrian one. And that was like 2016, I think, part 1. And I have not written a part 2 since, because I was so overwhelmed with the PhD and stuff like that. But at one point I'll get to it. But because this otherization, this question of like, at the core of a Lebanese, or the identity of Lebanese, and it doesn't have to be this way. This is actually the point that I'm trying to make as well. Like, identities are social construct. We can decide, like right now, we can decide how to change that in terms of like as a society or whatnot. There's no way of becoming Lebanese other than through inheriting it from your father usually, or maybe marrying into it because your husband is Lebanese, because as I said, like the women still cannot pass on nationality, or because, whatever, all of that stuff. Or in some very special cases, if you are like Salma Hayek or Shakira or whatnot, and the government wants you to become Lebanese, they will give you the nationality, or they will propose it in any case. Besides that, that's the joke, by the way, of like, how you can't, if you're Druze, you can't convert someone into the Druze religion. And so in theory, you're not allowed to marry an outsider. The exception being if you're George Clooney. In that case, it's fine. You can do that. In that case, you can do that. But we have a lot of exceptions when we want to. But
speaking of inheritance, I have to say it. You know that because we are refugees come in, we're not like legally allowed to inherit anything. So, b'mana, if a parent or a grandparent passes away, and for some reason they do have a property, a bank account, a car, or anything of wealth, because we're Palestinian refugees, we're not allowed to inherit it. And actually, these funds or properties go to Dar al-Fatwa or whatever. So, like, speaking of inheritance, it also brings up, the whole idea that, no, we're actually, our resources are being taken away, not the other way around.
The opposite. Quite literally the opposite.
So I've seen so many people who like save up money, or like, they manage somehow to get a property or something. And they're like, oh yeah, you cannot inherit your own dad or your own grandpa because you're a refugee status. There's no law for passing the inheritance, which is also, I think, taking away people's rights in a crazy way.
No, absolutely is. If anything, like this, the narrative, that's what I mean. But the narrative being so absurd, because it's like the opposite is true. It's literally like, well, actually, no, it's not that they are a burden on the state, quote unquote, but the state is literally stealing resources. And that's most of the time, that's what happens, because at the end of the day, people are people and they work like anyone else, or they do whatever else. And the logic, in order to have this separation between the inside and the outside group, you have to create this artificial line. And then it's then reinforced, as I said, through culture, politics, the state and whatnot. But like as a closing note on my side, and then I'll ask you to, if you kind of reflect a bit maybe on this conversation if you want, or especially I was kind of curious, like what's it like to engage with refugee studies as a field of academic study, being yourself a refugee, because I've been engaging on quote unquote Lebanese studies as well as a Lebanese, and it's been bizarre, to kind of put it, like it's been an experience. But legally, if the law just changes one day, if we have this political momentum, whatnot, then there could be a way of becoming a Lebanese. And this is something that for me, I feel like is such a crucial part of that puzzle in some sense, because there are for example, there's an Ethiopian woman I met. She's 45 and she has been in Lebanon since the early 90s. Basically, I was born in 91. She's been in Lebanon for basically all of my life. She speaks Lebanese Arabic. She hasn't been back to Ethiopia because the village where she comes from is pretty miserable. And so she hasn't been able, she also fled an abusive father at the time. And so I know that we talk regularly. She lives in Beirut, and I know that she's been there all her life, basically. She's, of course, illegal, because there's no way of renewing your visa indefinitely as a migrant domestic worker unless you have a kafil, like a Lebanese sponsor willing to sponsor your visa and whatnot, and she hasn't found one. And so she's been working basically in the black market for like a decade and a half now, or a bit longer, I don't remember, I think since the early 2000s. And if you ask her, like, where are you from? She'll tell you, of course, like, she's Ethiopian, you know, she comes from Ethiopia and whatnot. And there is no legal way for her to one day say, I'm also Lebanese, like, I'm a Lebanese Ethiopian. There's no legal way. The only way this is legally possible is if your father is Lebanese and your mother is Ethiopian. They get married, usually outside of Lebanon, and the kid is now Lebanese Ethiopian, is allowed to claim both nationalities. There are folks who are like that, of course. They tend to be in the minority because, for obvious reason, growing up in Lebanon is so difficult that they end up just growing up outside of Lebanon. So you have a bunch of like Lebanese Ethiopians who, if they go to Lebanon, they can be Lebanese, but only because they grew up outside of Lebanon. And this is one of the many, many contradictions of Lebanese-ness as an identity, is that one cannot become Lebanese. But of course, a Lebanese who leaves Lebanon can become American, can become Italian, can become Argentinian, which is my case, can become all of that stuff because we're special. But
that part always also confuses me, that how much every Lebanese family almost has a son that works abroad, that Absolutely. Is a migrant abroad. And so how do you how do you expect these countries to treat and employ and welcome your son or your family members, but you have these migrants in your country and you're so angry at them? Like, how does this also contradiction work in a way?
Because we're special, Yafa, because we're special. Okay, let me ask you to, that kind of as a closing note. I always ask guests towards the end to recommend 3 books, so feel free to do so on any topic that you want. And also just general reflections on what it's been like to engage on this topic, given that it is obviously so personal.
Yeah, it has definitely been an experience that I did not expect. I would not say I got tricked into it, but I kind of did. But I think, so when I moved here, I mean, obviously I was working in humanitarian aid, even in Lebanon. I was working at the UNRWA, so I was pretty interested in humanitarian aid, but I never thought that. So I came to do my master's degree in development studies because I was more interested in humanitarian development and so on. Mm. So I wasn't specialized in refugee studies. And then I think, when I started doing my PhD, and my professors were encouraging me to engage in refugee studies, since I know the topic so well as a lived experience, that I did not expect, or nobody warned me about, also the personal aspect, the emotionality, as you said, the situated knowledge, but also the whole positionality of it and the whole repercussions of your situation as a researcher / refugee. Mm. I grew up in Borj El Brajneh, and we always had this extensive flow of white researchers, white international organization workers, or volunteers. And, sometimes you would get these volunteers that are, very nice and very friendly, and they really believe in your cause. But a lot of times you also had these volunteers who were, we didn't have selfies at the time, but, the whole guilt washing, feeling that I saved Palestinian refugee children, feeling better about myself. I'm going to go there, take a few pictures of me saving the kids, and feel better about myself, and then go brag about it, about what a great activist I am. We also had a great bunch of researchers who really couldn't care any less about anything but actually getting a career jump out of our stories, and getting publications and citations out of whatever information they could get out of us. They would take your photos without asking. They would make you look as miserable as possible. They would really use you as a source of information in a very non-human way. And I think there's a really nice article about it. I think it's called Palestinian Refugees Are Not at Your Service. And it speaks about how when researchers arrive to refugee camps, they feel entitled to have information from you. And you should feel grateful that there are researchers who are coming to tell your story to the world and work towards someday, somehow, maybe in a million years, we don't know, maybe improving your life through their publications somehow. So they feel entitled. They feel that they have the right to come into your home. They have the right to have your story. They have the right that you share with them your intimate life, your personal life. And I think they often don't have enough respect for our privacy. Being a refugee means that you should always be available to have your photo taken and your life exposed and your details shared with the public. And that's just not okay. And I think there's also another article that's really interesting. It's called The Problem of Over-Researched Communities. And it's specifically about Shatila refugee camp. And it's about what happens when you have this big flow of researchers coming. One, it builds expectations that you think, oh my God, there's research being done. Khalas, tomorrow there's going to be a project or a program that's going to fix this problem that they're researching. And then it brings disappointment because these researchers, they come, they give you this hope, and then nothing happens. They go away and you don't know what they did with the information that they got. You don't know what kind of papers they published. You don't know if they said good or bad stuff about you. And you never see them again. And you end up feeling used. And it just brings so much disappointment to the community that the community doesn't trust research anymore. So I think me being on that end was really stressful in a way because I lived the experience of being under the interview and being under the lens. And I've seen these white researchers and I've seen how research works. And I did not want to be that. I did not want to do that to people. So it was very hard. Also, there's this really nice text by Dominguez. I think it's called For a Politics of Love and Rescue. And she says, if you work or research on people that you really care about, you are going to face real editorial dilemmas. Like, she's not saying don't do it, but she's saying you really have to stay attentive to the emotionality. You are going to get this is something I wish somebody told me before, that it's so hard. It was so hard to write this research because every time I was writing, even though it was general sometimes, it's like I was speaking about myself as a child. It's like I was speaking about my mother, my father, my relatives, my aunts, my friends, because they are still a part of that community today. They are still going through these things. And you also have to think of how privileged you are now since you have departed from that situation and you've become that privileged researcher that comes on a research trip and gets a career jump out of publishing someone's story. It's not a good feeling. Definitely, it's a very complex experience. And I would love to say that I have discovered a way to work around dealing with emotionality and dealing with this complex positionality, but I haven't. And if anybody's listening to the podcast and has a solution, please do drop a message and tell us that you find the right way to deal with working on research and the community you come from, especially if it's a community that's still fighting and struggling and you've just disconnected yourself a bit from that struggle, at least geographically. It's a very complex position, especially in refugee studies.
It just made me think of, again, experiences are not the same and I don't want to compare necessarily. But when I was living in Edinburgh, I went to therapy. And at some point, of course, the topic of the PhD came up. And it's like, so what's your PhD on? And I said, well, it's on hauntings and temporalities in post-war Lebanese cinema. I got used to repeating the title a number of times. And so she said, hauntings, what is hauntings? I said, okay, hauntology, Derrida, Mark Fisher, blah, 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 all of that stuff. I started explaining Jalal Toufi as well, and a bunch of different other theorists and academics. And then at some point, and this is why I stuck with that therapist, because I feel like she got it. She said, like, so you're studying ghosts? I was like, yeah, I guess I'm studying ghosts. And so she said, like, do you know why you're studying ghosts? And I was like, oh. I just had this realization that, oh, right. And we had this like very basic Freudian moment or whatever, like, oh, the thing that you're studying is actually yourself and all of that stuff. And of course, like there's still a need to have a degree of objectivity. So it's not a memoir or whatnot. But I actually mentioned now in the introduction of the thesis of the PhD, which inshallah will be published at some point soon. is it's a value explicit research. I was citing some scholar, I forgot who it is, but basically that like this idea that this can be an entirely quote unquote objective research is already not possible if you're just studying human beings in the first place, let alone if you have a personal connection to what's happening. And more often than not, it's much better to acknowledge this positionality, the potential biases, the whatnot, and then, you do the research and whatnot, and maybe you can actually see, because you acknowledge it, where those biases are, maybe, you should be more careful on this and that, rather than assume you don't have biases, which is the usual way of doing so, being quote unquote objective, and just, sorry for the term, but basically shitting on, basically just like, in covering in the entirety of that subject with all of your biases because you think you're being objective. And so that's kind of like my take on that. But,
it also aligns with it also aligns with what Donna Haraway says on situated knowledge. And like, I think the specific quote was that even our own organic eyes are mediated lenses. Like exactly. Even your own organic eyes, they're not showing you what's really there. It's showing you something that is mediated and a bit adjusted and a bit controlled and a bit modified and colored by the structure of the lenses that we have. So everybody has their own lens, and there is no such thing as unmediated image. And we're humans as researchers. Our images is always mediated. So that I totally agree with what you said.
Okay, so what I usually ask towards the end of episodes, like, what are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why those 3?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end the episode. So I do have 2 out of these 3 books here with me. The first book is kind of a bit of a personal one. It exists in both Arabic and English. I co-authored the Arabic version in 2016. So it was like the last thing I did before I left Lebanon. And it was this product of this workshop with this author called Hassan Dawood. And he was really so good in writing kind of in an autobiographic kind of way. And he trained us for, I think, the period of a year at the Palestinian Institute of Studies, asking us to write our stories as Palestinians. And it was published by the Palestinian Institute of Studies in Arabic in 2016. But actually this year, just a few months ago, it was translated to English. And so it's called 11 Lives. And it's actually just the lives of us, the 11 Palestinian refugees who come from very different Palestinian refugee camps across Lebanon. So there is our stories, our personal stories, but also how we relate to Palestine and how we relate to Lebanon. And there's also, for example, stories of refugees who are double refugees from Syrian refugee camps who were displaced later to a camp in Lebanon. There are those who went through double displacement, for example, because some refugee camps in Lebanon were, such as Tel Zatar and so on, they were abolished completely, or they were demolished, and then people were displaced again to another refugee camp. So it is just this summary of our stories and our lives and our experiences as Palestinian refugees. So this book really means a lot to me because it's like a direct, it's a direct story or narration from Palestinian refugees themselves. It's not someone telling our story. It's just us as refugees telling our story directly. So I think this will always mean a lot to me. Another book that I would really recommend, but I don't have it with me today, it's called The Ungrateful Refugee. And it's a book by Dina Nairi. And she is an Iranian author who has also worked in humanitarian aid, but also worked as a journalist. And she and her mom escaped from Iran. They came to Europe, and she tells this experience that is often shared among refugees, that whenever you arrive to a host community, everybody expects you to be so grateful, so thankful to the white world, to the Western world. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for rescuing us. And we're not supposed to speak. We're not supposed to have political agencies. We're just supposed to be thankful and grateful and not criticize anything. And we're supposed to be accepting anything that's given to us. And I think it's such a bold recollection of her own story, but then also of the stories of the refugees that she has encountered during humanitarian aid. So she also summarizes more recent stories from the last decades in Europe. So you will get to encounter in that book beautiful stories and genuine stories of refugees between past and present. And the last book that I really like is called Placeless People. And Placeless People is by Lindsay Stonebridge. It's published by Oxford, and it's mainly about writings and rights and refugees. And it's about why refugees write. And it's it's more of an academic study, but it's also very emotional and very inspiring if you are a refugee and you have to write stuff, because it studies or it explains how refugees write as a form of resistance, and how you telling your story as a refugee is a way of resisting to be forgotten and resisting oppression. I think one of the things that I like in this book, like one of the citations that she cites is all sorrows can be born if you put them into a story or tell a story about them. And then later she explains what that means. And she says that to suffer invisibly is to be dead to the world. And telling that story is you're resisting death. So it's like how, and she goes through a lot of refugee poetry and publications, but she has this beautiful explanation of how refugees can be agents and can be resistors and rebellions through writing. So I think these are my 3 favorite books, at least in this stage of my life.
Amazing. I'm going to buy all of them.
You should. They're really great. They really give you emotional experiences. All of them.
Amazing. Usually I recommend one book like that, but I just recently finished, we mentioned it before, Rebecca Solnit. I read her book, Orwell's Roses, which is one of those books I know I'm going to read again, because it's very detailed meditation. And also it's a work of nonfiction that includes journalism as well, and a bunch of other fields of trying to explain how Orwell's love for gardening actually informed a lot of his politics, including his anti-authoritarian politics. And in ways that really if you then reread or you read his other novels, like 1984 especially, you see how much there is a lot of imagery when it comes to gardening, to roses, to other flowers and other plants, in ways that's very, very interesting, the way she does it. And she ends up talking about the Cold War and about Stalin and about the West and about Orwell and the Spanish Civil War, all of that stuff through roses and through flowers, which I found really fascinating. So, okay. Yafa, thanks a lot for this. This was fantastic.
Thank you. I was so happy to do this. Thank you for having me.